HMS New Zealand was one of the Indefatigable class battlecruisers. She was the product of two aspects of British naval build strategy that came together in the same year. The Admiralty wanted to keep up a strong rate of construction to build a strong lead over Germany, and the government wanted to cut naval spending and pointed to the fact that after 2 years of HMS Dreadnought being commissioned, the Germans had still to bring even a single one of their new battleship type into service, and their attempt to reply to the Invincible class, SMS Blücher, had been a bad misstep thanks to British intel security and misdirection. Certain officers quietly ensured that the press got hold of the situation, and after a major public campaign, the government was forced to abandon its reduced plan for 4 ships. The Admiralty as well gave up its plans for 6, and the two arrived at a compromise for 8 vessels in the next budget. At the same time, on the colonial side of politics, the Admiralty had recently been advocating for the colonies to start moving towards providing local defence at sea, either by purchasing their own ships for their own navies, or else paying for the construction of Royal Navy ships to help guard them. Because of the sudden need to build more ships at a relatively low price due to the first budgetary issues described earlier, a revised form of the Invincible class battlecruiser was being prepared as opposed to Fisher's preferred design, which was basically an early version of the Lion class. And although New Zealand announced at first that it would fund a battleship, thinking at the end of the 1900s was shifting more towards the more distant colonies being better served by a battlecruiser. Enemy battleships were not expected to reach this far, but enemy cruisers would, and a battlecruiser would be able to chase down and destroy them, whilst also carrying enough guns to deal with older pre-dreadnought vessels and coastal defence units if any offensive action in these environs was needed. Thus, along with Australia, New Zealand sent funds for the construction of an Indefatigable class vessel. In the former case, this would be part of the new Royal Australian Navy. In the latter, it would remain part of the Royal Navy, since New Zealand couldn't afford to operate and maintain the ship on a day-to-day basis by itself. Each ship would be named for the country who had paid for it, and thus HMS New Zealand was laid down in June 1910, launched at the start of July 1911, and commissioned at the end of November 1912. Her first task was to go and visit the country whose name she bore, and so much of 1913 was spent in this role, where she proved to be quite the popular sight, and the captain would receive 2 incredibly important items for her soon-to-come combat service: a Maori warrior's skirt and a green pendant, both designed to protect from evil, along with strict instructions to wear them if ever the ship found itself in danger. Originally planned to guard the waters of the Western Pacific, rising tensions in Europe saw the ship recalled back to the UK. As this was technically in violation of the agreed reasoning behind the building of the ship, the government of New Zealand had to give its agreement. Fortunately they did, and the ship arrived back just before Christmas 1913. Initially part of the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron, with the arrival of more of the Lion class, she moved to 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron in the spring of 1914, alongside her sister ships Australia and Indefatigable. Wartime experience came thick and fast for the ship. In August 1914 she was present for the First Battle of Heligoland Bight, although her slower speed compared to the splendid Cats meant that she wasn't able to get properly stuck in for much of the battle. Obeying instructions, the captain donned the Maori war gear, setting a pattern for future battles, and New Zealand emerged from this encounter completely unscathed. During the raid on Scarborough, she almost caught the cruiser SMS Rune before being called away by Beatty, and in the Battle of Dogger Bank shortly thereafter, she and HMS Indomitable would once more be left somewhat behind, although she would gamely spend much of the battle battering SMS Blücher into submission, along with most of the rest of the battlecruiser fleet, after a confused signal from Beatty sent them all after what was left of the poor ship, when he'd actually meant for just New Zealand to finish her off. Once again, New Zealand emerged undamaged. Subsequent operations were mostly low-key, with the exception of an accidental collision with her sister HMAS Australia, which sent the latter vessel into dock for several months, although New Zealand was fighting fit after 5 weeks of repairs and was thus part of the fleet when it sailed for the Battle of Jutland. Despite the catastrophic detonation of both Indefatigable and Queen Mary, New Zealand took shots at SMS Von der Tann and SMS Moltke, the protective powers of the Maori limiting her damage to a single hit that chipped a bit of armour from her rear turret, and succeeding in blocking any further attempts by 1st Scouting Group, or indeed the High Seas Fleet, whose battleships also took New Zealand under fire, from doing any further damage. Instead, she would go on to score hits on SMS Seydlitz and the pre-dreadnoughts of the German 2nd Battle Squadron later in the combat. Following this, New Zealand, like much of the British fleet, would see no further enemy action. Instead, after the war, she would take Admiral Jellicoe on a tour of the Empire to replan British colonial defence policies. Unsurprisingly, the lucky ship proved very popular, especially in her name country. However, with her 12-inch weapons and thin armour putting her far behind the curve of modern ship design, her days were limited, and she would be sold for scrap in 1922 in order to draw down the Royal Navy's overall fleet strength to comply with the new Washington Naval Treaty restrictions. Although a number of items from her, the bell, some of the secondary battery, and her protective skirt and pendant, were saved and grace a number of museums in New Zealand to this day.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.